Hello everyone. Today's case involves an Indigenous man who decided to better himself by traveling across the province to attend college, only for things to completely take a turn for the worst and for him to disappear. 30-year-old Frank Gruben was born May 4th, 1993, to his mother Laura, and grew up in the remote western Arctic community of Aklavik, Northwest Territories, a hamlet in the Inuvik region with a population of around 1,500 residents. Frank was described as always being an outgoing, kind person who was very individual with those he spent time with, which resulted in him always having a lot of friends. He'd cook, share his food, and always had friends over as well. Frank always had a deep love for his culture and traditional language called Gwich'in, which he passed on by becoming an Indigenous language learner and respite worker. He worked with the NWT Disabilities Council and while speaking his traditional language in radio programs, in addition to reading to children in Gwich'in over the internet. It's also noted that he was part of the LGBT community. Frank's brother Stephen saying, quote, "My brother was always encouraging, always just jolly. Regardless of the state of mind, he made sure to let us know that he loved his siblings." End quote. Frank's mother says that he was particularly passionate about supporting his siblings, especially his younger sister, Kimberlyn, who has autism as well as Down syndrome. Laura saying, quote, "He really enjoyed looking after Kimberlyn. He was teaching her sign language and everything. Frank was always there, and he was a really big help to our family." End quote. In the summer of 2022, Frank made the long trip to Fort Smith, a town in the South Slave region of the Northwest Territories along the border of Alberta with a population of around 2,500 residents. He had plans there to upgrade his education at Aurora College. He also had goals to eventually become a social worker. While in Fort Smith, Frank would reconnect with an old classmate named Virginia Kodokak. The two had met in 2012 when they both attended Aurora College's Inuvik campus. But afterwards, she'd moved to Fort Smith to continue her education and raise her children. Frank was regularly at Virginia's home and spent a lot of time with her family. Another woman that Frank befriended while in Fort Smith was a woman named Ann Jackson, who became friends with him after they both attended a group session at college and he introduced himself in their traditional language. But Frank's college experience in Fort Smith wasn't everything it was chalked up to be. It was nothing that anyone expected. Because on December 5th, 2022, in the dead of winter, Frank would be kicked out of his dorm room at Aurora College over a noise complaint. At the time, he was staying at the campus's dorm-style Brainett Hall, a repurposed former residential school. Now, students getting kicked out of this college didn't seem to be out of the ordinary. It seemed to be a regular occurrence and something that was an issue there, whether it be because of, grades or behavior or just a number of things. It seems like it was an issue and the school really didn't care what happened to these individuals after they were kicked out. They didn't really care if these students were wandering homeless or if they were even completing their education, because it would seem like Frank attempted multiple times to put up ads to try to find, a room or an apartment to rent. However, housing seemed to be very hard to come by in such a small town. There wasn't much available, and the stuff that was available required him to have, a very decent paying job, which Frank was a college student. He didn't have that, even though he did have money coming in. And due to him not being able to find any permanent shelter, Frank began to start missing classes, and eventually he would drop out. Ann Jackson saying, quote, "When you're struggling with a roof over your head, a place, and stability, it eventually falls back on your education." Eventually, Frank started missing more classes and ended up not coming back to school, which personally angered me as a student and a close friend of Frank's, because I really don't want to see young people fail in school. It's the struggle with students coming from the north that really needs to be looked at, so they're not failing and they're not getting kicked out of their dorms. He didn't have luck. They wanted him to be employed in order to rent a room in town. And I was like, well, that's not fair. He's getting money. He could pay rent. I was told if a student gets kicked out of the residency, I'm not allowed to take them in. It's against policy. So in my head, I was like, so we're just going to leave them homeless? It doesn't make sense, especially during the winter time when it's cold. When you become homeless, you become desperate and destitute to have a roof over your head. He just went house to house. He always had these bags with him with clothes. He was always calling myself or Virginia when he needed help. It didn't matter what time it was. If he didn't have his phone, he was borrowing someone else's phone, and he'd reached out and we were always there to pick him up. End quote. Now, another big issue seems to be with this is that even though Frank was kicked out, his friends were trying to help him out by allowing him to stay there. However, there was a policy allegedly with the school where if a student was kicked out, they weren't allowed to stay on campus in another dorm, which I can kind of understand. On one hand, they were kicked out for a reason. We don't exactly know the reason why Frank was kicked out, just that it was a noise complaint, but what was the situation behind this noise complaint? Was it the first time? Was it multiple times this happened? We don't really know. But Anne was trying. She also lived on campus in campus housing. So she claims that, they weren't allowing someone else kicked out to still stay in the college dorms. It's just like such a double-edged sword. I could understand why the college would say that. Like, obviously he was causing some kind of issue. They don't want him to stay there then, but then also like, yeah, what is the other answer? He's homeless. Then we have the whole other issue of, the difficulty of renting in Canada. I'm sure there's similar issues in the US as well with renting where, even though he had most likely a significant enough income coming in from other sources, he didn't have, a traditional stable job. So they weren't allowing him to rent, which again, just means he's homeless then. Now, in multiple follow-ups, Aurora College reps were asked to confirm the existence of a policy that forbids students from taking in other students who have been evicted from college housing. And as of the publication of the APTN news article I was reading, the college had not yet responded to those requests, and the media had not found any copy of policy online that they could source from. But after Anne was allegedly told that she couldn't take Frank in, he just began to drift from place to place. Again, it was wintertime. It was extremely cold up there at that point in time. He couldn't just be on the streets. Now, here's the thing. Despite essentially being homeless now, Frank never told his family about the situation that he was in Fort Smith. Instead, he was making it out to his family to be the happiest time of his life, that he was, really enjoying himself. He was making the town his new home, and that he was making a lot of new friends there. He expressed a lot about these new friendships he was forming. But it seemed to be the farthest from reality when you really talk to the people who were in Fort Smith with him. His mother, Laura, saying, quote, "He didn't want to stick around here, that's for sure. There was a lot of people against him because of his sexuality. I think that's why he wanted to leave for Fort Smith, because he found partners down there and a lot of caring friends who would say they'd been there for him. We didn't know he was going through such a hard time, and if we knew, we could have probably prevented it. We as parents have to stand behind them. In my eyes, we're all God's children, and we should all be treated equally, no matter if you're gay, no matter the color of your skin. We have to be there for each other. Look out for one another." End quote. What a beautiful thing for a mother to say. And I could probably understand why Frank maybe didn't want to tell his family that he was having such a hard time in Fort Smith, because he probably just didn't want to go back home. He was an adult. He was 30 years old. He wasn't a teenager anymore. He could make his own choices. And, probably going to Fort Smith was this big, exciting experience for him. He thought maybe he would have a new start at life, maybe somewhere where he felt more accepted for his sexuality, maybe somewhere where he thought he would have more opportunities. And then everything seemed to crumble. Now, again, we don't know the reasons why things started to crumble why he was kicked out of his dorm specifically. But, things were very tough for him there. And maybe he just didn't want to admit defeat. He didn't want to admit that things were as bad as they were, because this was his fresh start. And what was the other option? To go back home where he didn't feel accepted and loved in the community there? He probably thought the best choice was to just stay in Fort Smith at that point. May 2nd of 2023, Frank would spend the night with Anne. He also mentioned to her that he had some errands to run downtown, so she took him there. He also took a selfie with her and one of her children. The next day, on May 3rd, Virginia invited Frank over so they could watch the hockey playoffs together. The following day, on May 4th, was Frank's 30th birthday. And so, hanging out, watching the hockey game would have been a bit of a celebration for them, for his birthday. That day, his mother, Laura, also called him and spoke with him, and she would be the last family member to ever speak to Frank again. But when the next day came and went, Frank completely stopped speaking to anyone altogether. Virginia reached out to him. His mother reached out to him, but no one got an answer from Frank. It was also noted, though, that the weeks leading up to Frank's disappearance, he didn't always have a cell phone with him. I'm not sure why, but he would always apparently find a way to respond or contact people. I'm not sure if he just didn't physically have a cell phone, or maybe his cell phone would die and he didn't have anywhere to charge it. But it seems like he would still be in contact with people. He always seemed to be able to call people or respond to text messages. Up until his birthday, it seems like. So by May 8th, when Frank still hadn't contacted anyone, Anne would finally decide to call the police and report him missing. Now, despite that radio silence after watching the hockey game with Virginia the day before his birthday, the RCMP would later find surveillance footage from Joseph B. Tyrrell Elementary School, time-stamped at 8:39 p.m. on May 6th, that showed Frank walking on McDougal Road and Field Street. Now keep in mind, this school is right next to Aurora College and the student housing complex. The footage is also very grainy, and I'm not sure what leads police to believe that this, figure in the footage is Frank. It makes me wonder what tips or information led them to knowing one way or another that this pixelated image is Frank. An officer would say, though, when interviewed, that, quote, "A ton of tips were received, but none of the information is lining up," end quote.
It is not the mandate of the RCMP to lead a search and rescue team. It is not a mandate that the RCMP has up here. So it has to be a community-led search.
Sergeant Kagri Yilmaz is with Fort Smith RCMP. He agreed to take APTN investigates around the community to some of the areas where Frank was last seen.
Right now, so we're driving by JBT School. We're on McDougal Road in Fort Smith, and we're approaching Field Street right now, where Frank Gruben was last seen. There was a ton of tips received, but nothing is adding up. So that's one issue that we faced. Conflicting stories. We felt like we were making a step forward when you'd make one step forward, 2 steps backwards kind of thing. So for us, that was very frustrating.
What duty can the RCMP do in, re-interviewing or getting them to question? Because it's normal, people might not tell the truth or bypass it to somebody else. I mean, how much can you pressure just to
We can't pressure them. What if we have a major development in a year or two, but we've pressured the witness when we should not have, and they told us something that's incriminating, then that doesn't become admissible in court.
According to Yilmaz, RCMP have followed up on a number of tips and have questioned all the individuals who were believed to be with Frank the evening of May 6th. APTN has tried to make contact, but no one has been willing to speak with us.
A civilian search would end up being coordinated in town looking for Frank. A helicopter would also be brought in to check areas of the Slave River and its banks, while residents on foot searched the forested areas within Fort Smith. Despite this, they were still calling for more volunteers. A woman named Larissa Emmons, who was helping coordinate the searches, would say, quote, "We could use all the volunteers we could get today. It's been exhausting for our volunteers that were out yesterday searching. The more people we have, the better we can search these areas and the more ground we can cover," end quote. 35 residents would cover most of the town. It isn't a very large amount of space to cover, honestly. This is quite a small town. They even brought in ATVs as well as a drone with infrared cameras. Yet despite it being such a small area to cover, they weren't finding any bit of evidence. They weren't finding Frank at all. The RCMP would also bring in one of their own search managers to help coordinate with the public search parties while they were also conducting their own investigation. However, it seems like the RCMP also wasn't finding anything. A big issue with Frank's disappearance is the vast amount of wilderness around this small town. Close by is Wood Buffalo National Park, covering almost 45,000 square kilometers. It's one of the largest parks in the world. So if Frank had met foul play, if he had been murdered and dumped somewhere, or if he had, decided to walk very far out of town and maybe unalive himself, he could honestly be anywhere out there. It's extremely, extremely remote, very rough land. It's very dense forest. So the chances of finding him out there make it very slim if that's where he is. In early July, police would speak with an update that they still hadn't conducted an official search on their own due to not knowing a specific location to look at and due to them being understaffed. Frank's mother, Laura, would say, quote, "I don't understand why it took so long to get something started. Like if it was somebody else, how fast would they look out, get the dogs, get the rangers," end quote. To make matters worse, at the end of that summer, a massive wildfire in the area would lead to the town of Fort Smith going into evacuation orders that would displace residents for 5 weeks before Parks Canada declared the wildfire less of a threat. But after this, Frank's case seems to have essentially gone cold, at least from the outside it looks like it has. And it's run into one of the biggest issues that I find most frustrating with these Canadian cases. It's something we've talked about in other cases before in Canada, and that is, due to there not being any evidence or any suspicion of a crime per se here, police are unable to get judicial authorization to access Frank's bank accounts, his phone, or his social media accounts. Meaning the answers may just be sitting there waiting to be found in maybe his text messages, maybe apps he was using, maybe he was possibly using like Tinder or Grindr. And it may be so easy to figure out what happened to him and who he was last in contact with that may lead to answers. However, due to police not being able to have any official evidence to start and use, they aren't able to access these accounts. It's just so backwards to me, and it's so frustrating. And it's ridiculous. What if the last text message he may have sent or the last phone call he may have made been to someone he was going to go stay with that night or maybe going to go hook up with, and that's the last person to have seen him? What if they lured him off? What if they murdered him? Police would then know who to look into. However, because they don't have, physical evidence now to get that information, we can't figure that information out. It's insanity in my opinion. And this case, I think, may be solvable if there wasn't for these stupid rules. If there was no foul play, then what could it be? The only other option, in my opinion, is that he may have unalived himself. But they can't rule foul play out because they can't properly investigate it. There are multiple examples of serial killers in Canada and the US that target gay men. There's also many cases of serial killers and killers targeting homeless people. And on top of that, we have an endless amount of missing and murdered Indigenous in Canada. And guess what? Frank was all three. His risk factor was as high as it could be. Remember, this is a small town where everyone seemingly knows everybody. So who could be responsible? Was it just someone passing through town that may have popped up on Tinder or Grindr or something of those sorts? And maybe Frank decided, hey, this is a new person. Maybe I'll go stay with them for the night. Maybe he was kidnapped by that individual because they had nefarious intentions. Or could this simply be because Frank hit rock bottom and he decided to just walk somewhere and unalive himself and he's just never been found? What are all of those tips that police have received, and why do none of the stories match up? On top of that, why did Frank go radio silent on his birthday, but then he was seen a couple days later wandering allegedly through town, or at least police think that's him? Or is that not him at all, and something happened to him on his birthday? Now, my heart truly goes out to this family because it would turn out that not only have they lost Frank, but another family member of theirs is missing, and his case has also never been solved. It would turn out that Laura's father, Frank's grandfather, Frank Cecil Stewart, also went missing during a work trip or a Dene Nation meeting in Hay River, Northwest Territories, in September of 1983. He has also never been found, but the RCMP did confirm that his missing persons file was still active. So that means Laura not only lost her father without answers, but she has now lost her son without answers. Frank's brother Stephen would tell APTN News, quote, "Is it nothing our family would ever wish upon anyone? It's devastating to try and live every day without my brother. We don't have any more time to waste. A lot of us need closure." End quote. Frank's case has prompted the development of the Northwest Territories Missing Persons Act, which will address some of the roadblocks that the Mounties have said that they've often encountered with such cases. Frank's been missing for nearly 2 years now. And in February of 2024, his family held a lantern ceremony in their hometown to remember him. APTN News would also do a deep dive investigation into his disappearance, which I'll have linked down below. I recommend checking it out. It's actually how I got a vast majority of the information on his disappearance. Now let's take one more good look at Frank, because there is a chance he may still be out there, or it may spark someone's memory seeing this. Frank is described as an Inuit man with black hair and brown eyes who is roughly 6 foot 1 inches tall and 176 pounds. According to the RCMP, he was last seen walking on McDougall Road and Field Street in Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. As I said, my heart goes out to this family. If you have any information as to what happened to Frank or where he may be, please contact the authorities. I'll have the information for them down below. Comment down below if there are any other cases you want me to look into. I'll add them to my list. And as always, I hope you all stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and hope to see you in the next video.